Now let's talk a little bit about separating the geometry that we have into multiple panels. So this is something where, now we talked about the advantages of building this as a single mesh where we could start to manipulate the shape and not have a lot of the problems that come with having separate pieces, but at some point it'll make our lives a little bit easier if we start to separate some of these pieces out. Now this helps by the fact that because this is, we're mimicking an actual vehicle, the actual vehicle is going to be built in panels much the same way. And so it'll really help not only as we start to add detail to some of these pieces, but also help to serve the realism of the model itself. And so to do this, we can go ahead and start to come in and select the faces that we want to actually extract out. And so we can come in and just maybe drag across these and start to think about where we want those panel divisions to actually occur. And so we can come in and select, for instance, this sort of middle trough piece, and we could split it down the middle, or we could actually create a seam on either side and maybe give a little bit of flexibility. All right, and so we can just go up here and extract that out. Okay, so now we have those as kind of separate pieces, and maybe this piece, this is where we're going to have kind of the these pieces coming in, so that might be a good place to have a seam as well. Okay, so we can come in and start to extract that. And what we'll start to see is that this makes our lives easier when we start to come in and add more detail to these pieces, because now we're dealing with isolated pieces, and the detail that we add, we don't have to worry about carrying any of that resolution into other parts of the mesh. We don't have to worry about inserting edge loops and they carry over. We don't have to worry about any of that. So we'll go ahead and extract that. And so you can see starting to separate some of those pieces out. I think probably having this separated out, this piece here, would be a good thing. And so we can go ahead and extract that out. Just as an example, coming in and kind of separating these out. Now if we look in our outliner and go ahead and open this up, you can see that we're still working with a single object, and then as we start to cut these pieces out, they're going to be sort of nested within this single poly surface. And so we can come in and select these, and you see if we delete the history, we can get rid of some of those transforms, but we can also just hit Shift P, drop those out, and create completely separate pieces, drop those out of that hierarchy that's created from the extraction, and get everything nice and separate. Okay, again, deleting the history will help with that as well. All right, so now that we have our individual pieces, we need to worry about light leaks. We have these pieces that are just butted up right against each other, and so if you have any gaps at all, you'll be able to see those. For instance, if I come in here and kind of open this up a little bit, if anything isn't exactly matched up, if we hit 7, we can go ahead and look at the lighting, and so you can start to see most of the time it looks fine, but you start to look around here and you can start to see these light leaks, and you want to avoid these. Even though the pieces are butted up right against each other, we want to actually have a little bit of penetration here so that it's completely light tight, unless you have a place where you really want to have a gap. If you have something where these pieces are supposed to be off of the surface and you can see that gap there, that's not really what I'm talking about. These are supposed to be pieces that are butted up right against each other, and again, that's just coming in using all lights, which is none, and being able to see that silhouette gives us an indication of that light leak. Now having those just butt up against each other, it may be fine, but I actually like to have kind of more of a realistic seam here, because if we're working with real pieces, they're not going to fit together that tightly. And so what we can do is start to come in and add to this. Now if we just had the flat object, we could extrude it and add the thickness, but we've already got the thickness. We've just got this sort of shell worked out, and it's all separated. So what we can do, let's go ahead and isolate this, is we can start to come in and select the edges, and let's actually just select one side at a time. All right, and then we can kind of extrude those, push them in a little bit to give us a little bit more geometry in there. Okay, now coming in and selecting that edge. Okay, and this is the original edge. If we kind of move that out a little bit, we get a little bit of detail there in that crevice. And so it's a little bit hard to tell without having done the other one, but it's going to be light tight, and it's also going to give us a nice little kind of a bevel there between these panels. We actually want to see where those panels meet. We don't want to have them just butt up right against each other. And so you want to actually do that here. Now the same thing applies to this one. Now this is just a flat piece, not a flat piece, but kind of a shell. It doesn't wrap around or anything like that. As you can see, if I pick it up. And so there, you might say that we could extrude these edges. We could also just extrude the object as a whole. So just going to extrude, okay, and pushing it down, okay, to give it that thickness. Now the thing with that is I can go in and now reverse the normals. So we've got that thickness here, but we don't need these interior pieces of geometry. You really want to save on that geometry. This is going to be inside, so if you do it the extrusion way, you can go ahead and delete those interior faces. Okay, or we could just again select those edges and do that with the with an extrusion on just the edges. Okay, and so we can start to break this into logical pieces. I think this piece would be a nice logical piece to break apart. Maybe this piece on the side here, I'd probably keep this as one piece, and then this piece down around the door I would keep as one piece. Okay, and just creating those seams wherever you have geometry butted up against one another. Try not to change the shape too much, because we've got that figured out with our low res pieces, but now we're coming in and starting to break it apart to create a little bit more of a realistic look rather than a very simple polygon shape here. Okay, so we just want to start to break apart these pieces into logical shapes. You can see a seam along this fender here. You could do another seam right along here, maybe cut out this front piece as well. I'd probably leave this as a single piece. Probably leave this as a single piece. Some of these pieces that are already that you may have on your model that are already separate, you don't have to worry about. But if you've built kind of a large shape of the model, that's something to think about as far as how you're going to break it apart. And again, we've got the whole model here, but you can really just delete half of this, and then you're just working with a single half. So you don't have to go in and, obviously cut apart both sides. You're just working with a single side, which you can then duplicate over. All right, pretty straightforward stuff, but just think about how you can break that apart, because now if we need to add resolution to this piece, it's very, very simple to do. If we want to add detail to it, we just want to make sure that the edges, we're careful around the edges, because that's what matches up with the other pieces of geometry. But now I can add this in a very isolated way, and it doesn't carry over to any of the other pieces. All right, so think about that when you're working with your military vehicles and building those faceted shapes, how to come in and actually separate those and break those apart. Make sure to watch for light leaks as well. All right, so a very important part of what we're doing here is how are we going to get a beveling effect on the edges. That's going to be a big part of getting something that looks nice and realistic. And there are a couple of ways that we can get that effect. So we'll take a look at some of those options that we have for that in the next lesson.